couple of weeks ago, I was made aware that the Nintendo Entertainment System's Final Fantasy 1 80% speedrun had just seen a new fastest time come fresh off the presses. It just so happened to feature one of my favorite things to talk about on this channel, RNG manipulation. Now I know this is a controversial topic in most of my videos' comment sections, but if you're still here after me speaking those forbidden words, you're gonna be in for a treat. As I was learning the ins and outs of the Final Fantasy 1 speedrun, I noticed in the World Records chat history that another runner was working on a different version of the game. Dragon Arch SDA was in the process of routing RNG manipulation for the Game Boy Advance release of the game, so it got me thinking, what are the other versions of the game like? From the Famicom's release back in 1987, all the way up to the 2021 release of the Pixel Remaster on PC, there are a total of 15 different platforms that these were released on. I looked into speedruns for some of these releases, and I was not disappointed. Not only have runners dived into these various releases, but each game has a different way it can be picked apart. So I decided that instead of celebrating one version of the game, why not all of them? Today, we'll be looking at all 15 releases of Final Fantasy 1 and seeing what runners have and haven't done with them. Before we get into the first release, please note that for the sake of time, I'll only be covering the fastest categories of each game listed on their respective leaderboards on speedrun.com. If you want to look into the other categories, such as no RNG manipulation, check out the link to each game's leaderboards in the description. To start out, we had the first iteration with the game's release on the Famicom. Even though there was a Final Fantasy 1 and 2 bundle released later, it had very minor tweaks, and I wasn't able to find any major differences from the original, so we're going to be skipping that version. The Famicom version is arguably the most broken out of the bunch, with runners being able to corrupt the game's memory in spectacular ways. When you first go into Cornelia Castle, you'll see that there are some stairs. If you watch my Final Fantasy IV glitch video, then you may know where this is going. The game uses a counter to keep track of what floor you're on in a respective area. The technical term for this is actually a stack. Usually, when you go into a room or upstairs, the counter goes up, and the game records various things like the map you were in and your coordinates before you left that room. When you go downstairs or leave a room, the counter goes down and it returns you to that last recorded information for that counter. Some sets of stairs, like the ones in Cornelia Castle, actually only increase this counter. If you keep increasing the counter and make the stack go too high, you'll overflow the stack, and some really weird things will happen. Runners walk up and down the stairs 32 times. This, combined with naming character 2 and naming character 3, allows the runner to access the in-game credits by opening the menu on a specific frame. There are 3 runners who have completed this in just 1 minute and 39 seconds, but only 2 have video recordings, so that's what you'll see here. As one could imagine with such a short category, this run is extremely optimized and probably won't see another record for a long time. For our next entry, we'll be covering a device that was a gaming wonder for its time. The MSX2 home computer had its own version of Final Fantasy 1 with some relatively large changes and bugs from the Famicom release. Things like updated sprites, graphical changes, and a few shop and game mechanic differences were included with this. The main one of these unintentional changes being that enemy resistances in the normal Famicom version were flipped to actually being weaknesses, and their original weaknesses no longer being there. While this is very interesting, there's also an additional bug where enemies randomly resist all magic, which makes some bosses impossible to beat on the first try. With no US release, this one flew under many people's radar. Right now, the main way people run this game is through the use of an emulator due to how convoluted it can be to capture the game directly, and thanks to how costly it can be to acquire a physical setup. As a result, this version is relatively unexplored when it comes to speedrunning. A runner by the name of Shane Zell completed this in 5 hours, 56 minutes, and 31 seconds. This version does not feature the same credits warp capabilities that the Famicom version had, so this run requires going through the entire game. Starting out, Shane uses 2 fighters, a red mage, and a black mage. The black belt, better known as the monk in future releases, is actually broken to the point where the class can't be used in this version. This is due to them not getting any sort of unarmed or unarmored bonus. This is especially bad since buffing spells like Temper and Saber don't work in these early releases, so that means that fighters and mages dominate the class hierarchy. As for the route, it features the mainly linear path of going through some of the smaller main quests and the 4 Fiends fights. It also includes getting the Rat's Tail in the Castle of Ordeals and upgrading character classes at Bahamut. Some grinding is required to get Gil for weapons and spells, especially in the early game. Thankfully though, with all the spell resistances flipped, runners can easily defeat bosses using the Bane spell. This includes the final boss, Chaos. Overall, this run has at least an hour of time save due to many encounters having to be taken, and about 30 minutes of time lost from Chaos randomly resisting all spells in Shane's first attempt at the fight. An interesting thing about this time save is that a lot of it is actually seen in the next version's speedrun. The NES localization didn't see many gameplay changes from the Japanese version, and doesn't have some of the crazy bugs from the MSX2 release, but the speedrun is actually much different from that one, both in terms of length and strategies used. The fastest category uses an intricate RNG manipulation to make the entire run mostly a test of skill instead of enduring wild swings of randomness. Runners start by setting up manipulation pre-run. This is similar to resetting and setting an optimal seed prior to doing runs in Final Fantasy IV's Super Nintendo version. F. Coughlin does this by getting into an encounter and checks damage rolls he gets right outside of Cornelia. This sets up the proper RNG values needed to sort through the game. If you think that's crazy, wait until you see what classes he used. That's right, Captain Crunch's Oops All Fighters is how this run is going to go. Not just that, but in order to save time, the manipulation only leaves one party member alive after Garland, making the whole run a one-man show. There are a couple of different aspects of the manipulation to keep in mind for this run. Step counting ensures runners can have specific encounters where they want in a run, and there's also points where runners will take additional steps in order to get one encounter over another. For example, moving tiles to take an encounter while on the ship instead of taking an encounter on land is a strategy that is used. Speaking of ships, while on the ship, you can perform something called a canal glitch with the step route. Basically, when counting steps, you advance the step route with each step that you take. For some reason, when running into the canal before it's blown up with TNT later on, it advances the step count by 1 value per frame, or 60 values a second. We have a runner named Geyer to thank for this one, due to him forgetting to blow up the canal on a previous attempt. This doesn't save any encounters, but it gives him encounters that have much less enemies in battle than others, with a total of 18 more favorable battles than without the glitch. Though this stuff is really cool, that's not all F. Coughlin has in his arsenal. For battles, there's something called Battle RNG that only progresses during encounters. To start out, RNG moves forward once for every 2 frames that the cursor is on screen. The main way F. Coughlin makes this progress consistently is by canceling the menu to push RNG values forward to a favorable point. These are affectionately called bounces. This allows him to take on and defeat most enemies in minimal hits, and with as little damage to them as possible. To break it down even further, the values are progressed by short and long inputs. Basically, the game adds in some delay to make sure you want to hold the same buttons down. The first input will progress the RNG value by 1, but the second one while held down will increase it by 5, and then every subsequent one held will be by 3. This applies to technically every button input, but you can only consistently buffer the B input to continue the battle while bouncing. The only exception to this route is when he drops the manipulation at the end of the game to opt for the Bane instant kill strategy on Tiamat and Chaos. These both are manipulated in their own way by using an audio cue during both fights to hit a 2-frame window for the spell to work. He gets both of these in his run to save a large amount of time to snag the first 2-hour, 5-minute, and 55-second run. There are some other small aspects of randomness in this run that fall mostly to bats and other NPCs getting in the way in some of the dungeons, but otherwise, the run is mostly optimized and requires massive skill and focus to take it on. Moving on to our next release, we'll have to take everything we know so far and actually throw it out the window. Moving into another one of the more obscure releases of Final Fantasy I, the WonderSwan handheld console was made by Bandai back in the late 1990s, with the follow-up WonderSwan Color console being released on December 9th, 2000. These consoles never made it stateside, so it makes sense if you've never heard of them. Final Fantasy I was re-released alongside the launch of the WonderSwan Color, and was the first true remaster that the game would see. This remaster updated many graphics, allowed for redirected attacks when targeting an enemy defeated by another party member on the same turn, and updated the item system as well. However, one of the most important updates was being able to hold a button to run in towns and dungeons. This version is like the MSX2 release, where runners need to use an emulator in order to capture the gameplay directly. The fastest time for this version is by our veteran Final Fantasy runner that we mentioned earlier, Geyer, with a time of 4 hours, 14 minutes, and 29 seconds. This run notably makes use of the 15 puzzle game 5 separate times to get a total of 50,000 gil to cut down on treasure selling and monster grinding early on. This lets runners shop for powerful equipment and spells in Elfheim. The Temper spell is also something that will become sort of a mainstay in releases from this point on, since it allows for powerful attacks on whoever is buffed by it. Buff spells like this are present in the earlier releases, but they don't work correctly, so they're not really factored in. Besides this, Geyer's route has some occasional grinding to ensure he's powerful enough to take on some of the main boss fights throughout the run. For example, the Lich leads with Ice 2 and Geyer's PB, which does massive damage to the party. This acts as an HP check, where you wouldn't have enough health if you were any less than level 10 or so. This run has some RNG throughout, but it mainly rears its ugly head in the Castle of Ordeals and in the final Chaos Shrine dungeon. Regular enemies can defeat the party with ease, and the final battle comes down to just getting lucky. With some work, this run can be pushed down by a lot, and we have a good indication of how far it could go in our next version. Moving to the PS1, Final Fantasy Origins, the game is very similar to the WonderSwan Color release, except for the major change of easy mode being added. This made shop prices cheaper, experience being gained faster, and many other things to make the game easier for the player. It also introduced memo saving, allowing players to make a quick save anywhere. Even though there was only one save slot, and it only stayed as long as the console was powered on, this was useful in making safety saves before major events and boss fights. This would mean if you died anywhere in the run in a dungeon, you wouldn't have to start the entire dungeon over. The run setup is very similar to the WonderSwan Color version of the game, with 3 red mages and 1 warrior being used for buffing and attacking. The route is also about the same, the main difference being that the fastest run of the PS1 version is done under the easy mode option I mentioned earlier. This means that the 15 puzzle game needs to be done less times, and less grinding needs to happen overall. The memo file is also used to quick save at certain points before runners get encounters. If you proceed after saving and you get an encounter, you can reset the console, load the file, and basically reset the amount of steps it will take to get into a fight. There's still a lot of luck involved with predicting when the encounters will happen, so you don't lose a lot of time when resetting. Overall though, this run is much faster and safer than the WonderSwan Color version. Dragon Dart's SDA was able to get a 2-hour, 37-minute, and 20-second time using the strategies mentioned. This route is also a bit different than the WonderSwan run, like opting to come back to Merilith after Tiamat for an easier fight overall. With the PS1 version out of the way, we move on to our next version, one that finally set the bar for how each Final Fantasy I release would work after it. The Game Boy Advance release, Final Fantasy I and II Dawn of Souls, saw even more changes than the previous versions. New items, game engine tweaks that changed how some classes worked, an overhaul of the spell system to use MP, and it even fixed major bugs that had been present since the Famicom release. With all these changes, the initial character setup had to change as well. The Red Mage received a debuff, so 2 of the 3 mages were dropped in favor of the other classes. In the current fastest time, the Monk is now used thanks to a buff to the class, and the Black Mage thanks to intelligence finally affecting how magic attacks deal damage. Easy mode was also made the default difficulty, so there was no longer any need to select that at the beginning of a run. Despite all that, the run actually starts out the same as most other runs after the WonderSwan Colors remaster. However, compared to only using the treasure game 3 times like in the PS1 run we just went over, the treasure game is used 8 times because even though you can get awesome prizes for beating it, unfortunately, it only offers 100 gil as a reward instead of the 10,000 for first place in the in-game leaderboard. Another thing to go along with the buff of the Monk class is that he becomes the primary damage dealer of the party. and an excellent one at that. Boss fights typically start out with the red and black mages using temper, and the warrior using haste on the monk. Then the rest of the time is just spent attacking and using temper on the monk. Encounter skipping is still present in this version, thanks to the memo save system being dropped in favor of being able to save anywhere, though it seems to be less used due to how long it takes to get back into the game after a soft reset. This run also maintained the same route as the previous one, except for one huge detail. It cuts out the entire Citadel of Trials and doesn't require the job upgrades provided by Bahamut, saving a possible 10 minutes, if not more. The current best time for the game is by a Japanese runner by the name of Poison Chihuahua with a time of 2 hours, 22 minutes, and 45 seconds, and it's possible to see even more time save thanks to the wild swings of randomness in the run. Moving on to our next game, here's where things get a little bit weird. Bandai released the Final Fantasy I Java game for mobile phones in 2004, which would receive a brief port to the US in 2010 before our next entry in the series. Due to this being pulled the same year as an upcoming version, and there being no speedruns of it, we'll have to skip it. Moving on to what most would consider to be the definitive edition of Final Fantasy I, with enhanced graphics and bringing the Dawn of Souls mechanics, script, and dungeons into the fold, this not only made it one of the most popular releases of the game, but also one of the most popular Final Fantasy I any percent speedruns with over 150 runners. Why is that? Well, it's because the game is absolutely busted. Let me explain. It's not like there's a huge credits warp at the beginning of the game, but there's another cool glitch that can be done as soon as you go into a shop. The equipment glitch. This glitch allows you to do a couple of different things. First, it lets you put equipment on classes that otherwise wouldn't normally be able to use them. Second, and this is the most broken aspect of it, you can actually generate any item you want in your inventory if certain criteria are met. This is used to not only generate several knights' armors to massively increase defense, but they also sell for 18,000 gil, which is absurd for the beginning of the game. Not only that, but in the Chaos Shrine after getting the leather cap, it can be used to give everyone in the party a judgment staff. The staff normally can only be obtained by defeating a Tomos in the additional dungeons, so it's extremely powerful. This is actually the second strongest staff in the game, and when used in the inventory, it casts flare. There are multiple equipment menus to do that generate things to keep up with the bosses, but the theme of the run stays the same throughout. Remember how all the grinding and running away that needed to be done in the previous runs? That's pretty much all gone now. Even the puzzle game is no longer needed due to selling equipment for massive amounts of gil. This brings the top time down to an incredible 1 hour, 20 minutes, and 4 seconds by Soma SR. For our next releases, things start to get weird again. The Wii, 3DS, and Wii U Virtual Consoles have the Famicom version for download, but no one opts to run these, as the community is established around the NES version. It's also possible that there are bug fixes that completely fix some glitches and even how RNG works. The NES Classic also came with Final Fantasy I, but like the VC ports, this one isn't ran by the community either. The PS1 version was released on the PSP, PS3, and PlayStation Vita, but runners opt to use the original PS1 version for speedruns instead. After the craziness of the Java game being released and dropped from the mobile phone platforms, the Anniversary Edition came to iOS, Android, and even the Windows Phone starting in 2010. As expected, no one runs these versions either. There was later a port to the 3DS with first print copies of Final Fantasy Explorers, and then it released on the Japanese eShop later. Again, due to availability, video capturing issues, and a lack of difference in the ports, runners just opted to use the PSP version of the game. On July 28, 2021, Square Enix released the first part of the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster series. This port actually changed many things about how the game works, trying to be faithful to the original release, but adding some of the spice that was introduced in the remakes. The spell system went back to the charge system that was present in earlier versions, meaning that MP does not exist anymore, but stats and level mechanics are retained from the GBA version of the game, among various other patches that were implemented. So what does this mean for the speedrun? Well, for the first time in a few generations, the run was slower overall, but still faster than even the GBA version. This is mainly thanks to changes on how movement works in general. Being able to run in the overworld and even moving diagonally cuts out much of the movement that took up time in the previous releases. The strategies end up being similar to the GBA release of the game, with the monk being the focus of any buffs. However, levels become very important in the run as the chaos fight is highly unpredictable and needs to be finished in as little turns as possible, kinda like many previous entries in the series. This means that every encounter that the runner gets into, they need to fight instead of simply running away. The current fastest time is actually by Thunderclawed, who obtained a 1 hour, 52 minute, and 33 second run back on September 6, 2021. Surprisingly, the most popular category, 80% glitchless, only has just under 25 runners, with only 3 runners having a sub 2 hour run. With more grinding of the game, times could easily go down into the sub 1 hour and 50 minute range. With the last version speedrun out of the way, I'm sure you're just as surprised as I am at how different and amazing each release's speedruns are. From manipulating every encounter to glitching in the most powerful equipment in the game, runners from every generation find awesome ways to get through each of these games. Well, that's what I would say if we were actually done with the video. You see, I actually lied to every single one of you. There's one more version of Final Fantasy I we haven't even looked at. Though this isn't the full release of the game, Stranger of Paradise, Final Fantasy Origins demo, has seen its fair share of speedrunners take a crack at it. The fastest run clocks in at just under 4 minutes long with the New Game Plus Easy category by Bill Versus. The goal is simply to take out the 2 dark vents blocking your path and then to defeat Garland to end the demo. There's not much in the way of strategy besides taking an optimal path and avoiding any knockback damage when possible. In fights, runners just cast Reinforce and Mighty Strikes, then they use heavy attacks to take down enemies. With that out of the way, we've covered all of the games and remasters of Final Fantasy I that people have taken the time to absolutely break. Which one was your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Stay hydrated, folks, and thanks for watching.